The average house in Canada costs more than $700,000. That number gets thrown around so much it's almost lost its power to shock. But let me reframe it for you. That's $700,000 for a house in a country that is literally the second largest on the planet. A country with more fresh water than anywhere else on Earth. More forest, more sky, more nothing, more space than almost any other nation in human history. And yet somehow, we convinced ourselves there isn't enough room. Here's what nobody in the housing debate wants to say out loud. There are towns in Canada right now, real towns, with roads and schools and hockey rinks, where you can buy a house for less than you'd spend on a used pickup truck. Sometimes a lot less. The question isn't whether these places exist. They do. The question is, what happened to them and what's quietly starting to happen again? Number 10, Trois-Rivières. Quebec, it doesn't require a float plane to reach. Trois-Rivières, Quebec sits right on the St. Lawrence River, halfway between Montreal and Quebec City. It has a university. It has a real downtown. It has culture and a genuine art scene and, by every measure you'd care about, it's a functioning mid-sized Canadian city. And yet it regularly ranks as the most affordable, sizable city in the entire country. According to a 2025 Moving to Canada survey, average monthly living expenses in Trois-Rivières come in under $1,100. Not rent, total living expenses. When you compare that to what Canadians in Toronto or Vancouver are spending, it doesn't even feel like the same planet. So how did this happen? For most of the 20th century, Trois-Rivières was one of the most important industrial cities in the world, not just in Canada. The world. It was a global newsprint capital. The mills that lined the St. Lawrence churned out the paper that printed the newspapers of New York, London, Paris. Generations of Quebecois families built their lives around those mills. They were steady, they were unionized, they paid well, and they seemed permanent. Then the internet happened. Then advertising left print. Then one by one, the mills went quiet. By the 2000s, an economy that had been built on paper had become, in its own cruel irony, history. The jobs didn't come back in meaningful numbers. Young people left for Montreal. The population aged. The housing stock, which had been built for a much larger and more prosperous city, sat there, priced for a market that no longer existed. And here's what nobody tells you about Trois-Rivières. The infrastructure is still there. The university is still there. The river is spectacular. The food is genuinely good. And for anyone willing to build a life in French or learn, this city offers something almost no other place in Canada can match. Actual affordability in an actual city. It's not a compromise. For the right person, it's a revelation. The reason it sits at number 10 rather than higher on this list is that it's not cheap because something went catastrophically wrong. It's cheap because the economy shifted and the city hasn't fully caught up yet. That's very different from what comes next. Because starting with number 9, we are going to get into towns where what happened wasn't slow decline. It was collapse. Number 9, Thetford Mines, Quebec. Thetford Mines sits in the Chaudière-Appalaches region, about an hour and a half south of Quebec City. For nearly a century, it was one of the most important mining towns in the world. Not coal, not iron ore, asbestos. At its peak, this region produced a third of the world's asbestos supply. The mines were massive. The money was real. The town built schools and churches and arenas on the back of what the industry called white gold, and then the science caught up. By the late 20th century, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Asbestos kills people. It causes mesothelioma, cancer with almost no survivors. The industry fought the science for decades, and it won those fights longer than it should have. Canada, embarrassingly, continued to export asbestos to developing countries well into the 2000s, even after domestic use was essentially banned. It's one of the less proud chapters of Canadian industrial history. The last major asbestos mine in Thetford Mines closed in 2011, and the town was left holding an identity it could no longer claim and an economy with a very large hole in the middle of it. Here's what nobody tells you about Thetford Mines. The homes are genuinely cheap, and the community is genuinely complicated. Property prices here rank among the lowest in Quebec. But the reason matters. The environmental legacy of a century of asbestos mining doesn't disappear when the mine closes. The dust settles into the earth, into the air, into the history of families who lost members to diseases the company insisted. For decades, weren't its fault. Buying property in Thetford Mines means buying into a community that is still, in some ways, processing an enormous collective wound. That doesn't mean you shouldn't. People live there, raise families, build businesses. But you should go in understanding what that place has been through. It also means doing your homework on the specific property. Environmental remediation is an ongoing issue in the region. What's under the yard matters in a way it doesn't in most Canadian towns. The price is low, the history is heavy, and the gap between those two things is the whole story. Number 8, Leaf Rapids, Manitoba. In 1970, the Manitoba government decided to do something ambitious. They were going to build a town from scratch. Not just houses, a whole town. Leaf Rapids was planned from the ground up to be different from every other Canadian resource town that had come before it. Government planners looked at the failures of boom-bust communities across the country and said, "We can do this better." They built a central town complex with a mall, a pool, a library, a theater, all under one roof, connected by heated walkways, because someone finally acknowledged that it gets extremely cold in northern Manitoba. They built schools. They planned for community. Sherritt Gordon's copper and zinc mine was the economic anchor, but the town itself was designed to outlast it. It didn't. The mine closed in 1993. The population, which had peaked at over 2,000 people, collapsed to under 500. The beautiful planned town center fell into disrepair. The mall became a ghost of its blueprint. Manitoba Housing took ownership of much of the residential stock because there was no market left to absorb it. And here's what nobody tells you about Leaf Rapids. It is genuinely beautiful. The Burntwood River runs nearby. The boreal forest comes right to the edge of town. The sky at night, hundreds of kilometers from any significant light pollution, is the kind of thing that makes people from southern cities stop talking mid-sentence. Properties here are some of the lowest-priced inhabited real estate in Canada. And inhabited is the key word. People still live here. There's a school. There's a grocery store. There's a community of people who chose to stay or chose to come. It's not a ghost town. It's a small town that never got to be what it was supposed to be. The irony of Leaf Rapids is profound. A government built it specifically to avoid the failures of other resource towns, and then couldn't protect it from the exact failure it was designed to prevent. The mine closed, and the plan couldn't save it. What comes next on our list is a town that tried something completely different to survive, and almost pulled it off. Number 7, Elliott Lake, Ontario. Elliott Lake was built in the 1950s in the hills of northern Ontario to mine uranium. At the height of the Cold War, uranium was everything. The town boomed. Tens of thousands of people moved into this remote stretch of the Canadian Shield. Mines operated around the clock. The place had energy, purpose, and a future that seemed written in the rock itself. Then the Cold War wound down. Uranium demand collapsed. By the late 1980s, the mines were closing, and Elliott Lake faced a choice that most dying resource towns never get to make consciously. It actually sat down and planned its next act. What they came up with was, on paper, brilliant. They would market Elliott Lake as a retirement destination, specifically targeting seniors from southern Ontario who were priced out of the cities they'd spent their lives in. The town had affordable housing, clean air, access to nature, and a surprising amount of infrastructure left over from the mining days. They launched an actual national marketing campaign. And it worked. For a while. But a town built around retirees has a demographic problem baked inches. Retirees age. They require more services, more medical care, more support, and eventually they pass on. The population began to skew older and older. And then in 2012, the Algo Center mall roof collapsed, killing 2 people and injuring several others. It became a national news story, not just a tragedy, but a symbol of what happens to infrastructure in forgotten towns when there's not enough money, not enough people, and not enough political attention to maintain what earlier generations built. And here's what nobody tells you about Elliott Lake today. It's changing again. Remote workers from the greater Toronto area are showing up. Young families priced out of southern Ontario are making the 4-hour drive north and discovering houses they can actually afford to buy. Move-in-ready homes attract multiple offers now. The fixer-uppers sit a little longer, but not as long as they used to. Elliott Lake has been through more reinventions than almost any town its size in Canada. Whether this latest one sticks is the question it's living with right now. Number 6, Flin Flon, Manitoba. Named after a fictional submarine captain in a paperback novel a prospector was reading when he discovered the ore body in 1915. Flin Flon is one of the most genuinely strange communities in Canada. And not just because of the name. It's also one of the only municipalities in the country that straddles 2 provinces. The main town is in Manitoba. Part of it spills into Saskatchewan. The provincial border runs right through the community, which creates situations that are exactly as administratively confusing as you're imagining. For nearly a century, the town was built around the Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting Company. The smelter was the heartbeat of Flin Flon, visible for kilometers, belching copper and zinc into the northern sky, employing the families that filled the streets. When the smelter closed in 2010, that heartbeat stopped. The population has been declining ever since. Flin Flon has lost a significant portion of its residents in the years since the closure. And the housing it left behind, it's available at prices that make most Canadians do a double take. But here's the part that makes Flin Flon unlike almost anything else on this list. The city itself has gotten into the real estate business. Right now, on the City of Flin Flon's official website, there are municipal properties for sale by public tender. You submit a bid, a proposed use for the property, and a plan for what you'll do with it. The city reviews your submission, and, if they like what they see, you get the land. And here's what nobody tells you about this process. It is quintessentially, gloriously Canadian. You don't just show up and buy. You fill out a form. You explain yourself. You wait for a committee to decide whether your vision for the property aligns with the community's interests. It's the most politely bureaucratic way imaginable to acquire distressed real estate, and it somehow makes Flin Flon even more endearing. The town sits on the edge of some of the best canoe country on Earth, surrounded by lakes that most of Canada has never heard of. It has a character weird, resilient, genuinely northern, that you cannot manufacture. What you can't manufacture is what we're about to get to. Because numbers 5 through 1 aren't just cheap. They're the kind of stories that stay with you. Number 5, Iroquois Falls, Ontario. This town in northeastern Ontario exists because of paper. Specifically, because Abitibi Power and Paper Company decided in the early 20th century that the Abitibi River was the perfect place to build a mill. And so they built one. And around the mill, they built a town. Houses, a hospital, a school, the whole infrastructure of a life, because the company needed workers to stay, not just to work. The Abitibi Mill ran for decades. It was the kind of operation that becomes invisible when it's working, just part of the fabric of a place. You notice it when it's gone. The mill is gone. The population is in decline, down 2.8% and still falling. Unemployment hovers near 9%. nearly double the national average. The Abitibi River still runs through town, cold and dark and indifferent. And on Realtor CA right now, you can find properties in Iroquois Falls starting at $27,000. $27,000 for a house in Ontario, in a town an hour from Timmins, surrounded by boreal forest, with roads and services, and a real community of people who live there year-round. The few properties that are genuinely move-in ready don't sit long. There's a small but growing current of buyers, mostly from southern Ontario, who are doing the math and realizing that the numbers work in a way they haven't seen in 20 years. Buy in Iroquois Falls for $30,000. Spend another $30,000 renovating. Live mortgage-free in a house you actually own, while the rest of your generation rents indefinitely in cities they can't afford. And here's what nobody tells you. The town itself is not without its appeal. The Abitibi River Valley is genuinely beautiful in a way that's hard to photograph. The people who have stayed are the kind of people who have chosen to stay, which says something about their attachment to the place. There's a stubbornness to Northern Ontario communities that you either find inspiring or claustrophobic, and you'll know which the moment you arrive. The catch is the math that doesn't show on the listing. Property taxes. Heating costs in a January that hits -30. The distance to a specialist hospital if you need one. Iroquois Falls is not for everyone. But for the right person, it might be exactly right. Number 4, Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. Glace Bay sits on the northeastern tip of Nova Scotia, on the coal-bearing rock that made Cape Breton famous and then broke its heart. The mines here ran for more than 100 years. Coal from Glace Bay heated homes, powered industry, and funded the culture, the music, the Gaelic, the ferocious Cape Breton identity that people from this island carry with them wherever they go. The Devco mines closed in stages through the late 1990 and into the early 2000s. The federal government wound down the Cape Breton Development Corporation, and with it went the economic logic that had held Glace Bay together for a century. The population fell by roughly 40% from its peak. Properties sat empty. Storefronts went dark. The town became one of those places that Southern Canadians vaguely associate with hard times and fiddle music, and not much else. Then something strange started happening. Cape Breton started getting discovered. Not by industry, by people. Remote workers from Halifax and Toronto, who looked at the cost of living in Glace Bay versus the cost of living anywhere else, and did the math. Retirees from Ontario who'd heard their whole lives that Cape Breton was beautiful and finally made the trip and realized the rumors were true. Younger Canadians who decided that a house they could actually own in a community with actual culture was worth the trade-offs. Properties under $50,000 appear on Zillow and Realtor.ca with some regularity in Glace Bay. And here's what nobody tells you. Some of those listings are getting multiple offers. In Glace Bay, on houses that cost less than some Torontonians spend on a year of parking. It's still a town with real challenges. The economy is thin. The winters are real. The distance from major centers matters. But there's something alive in Glace Bay right now that wasn't there 10 years ago. A feeling that the tide might actually be turning. Whether it does will depend on whether the people coming in stay long enough to matter. Number 3, Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. Tumbler Ridge, BC, didn't grow organically. It didn't start as a fur trading post or a CPR way station or a homesteader's dream. It was built on purpose by the British Columbia government in 1981, in the space of just a few years, in the middle of the northeastern Bay Sea. Rockies because Japan needed coal. That's the origin story. A consortium of Japanese steel mills signed a contract to buy 100 million tons of B.C. coal over 15 years for a total of $7.5 billion. And so the government built a town. They cleared the forest, laid the roads, put up the houses, built the schools and the recreation center and the whole infrastructure of a community, and then they filled it with people. By the mid-1980s, Tumbler Ridge had nearly 5,000 residents. It had a planned layout, mountain views out every window, and what felt like a guaranteed future. Then global coal prices started dropping. The Japanese consortium pushed for price reductions. The mines resisted, then struggled. Then the Quintet mine closed in 2000. The Bull Moose mine closed in 2003. And the town, this entire deliberately constructed community, began to empty. Hundreds of houses were auctioned off in the fall of 2000. One man, who would later become the mayor of Tumbler Ridge, moved into town right after the closure and bought his house for $28,000. At the absolute bottom of the market, homes were reportedly going for $25,000. The company that built the Canadian government's Northeast Coal Project had incurred a net loss of $2.8 billion. The town it left behind was selling houses for the price of a used snowmobile. And here's what nobody tells you about Tumbler Ridge. Coal came back. New mines opened. By the early 2010s, average house prices had rebounded to over $130,000. Then coal slumped again. Then, in September 2024, the Quintet mine reopened under new ownership, after 24 years sitting silent, with a $500 million restart plan and 400 new permanent jobs. This town has gone from boomtown to ghost town to boomtown, and back more times than any other community in Canada. Every cycle leaves different people holding the bag. Every revival surprises people who had already written it off. If you want to understand the psychology of a Canadian resource town, the hope and the vulnerability, and the way a whole community can swing on the price of a commodity traded on the other side of the world, Tumbler Ridge is the place to study. Number 2, Schefferville, Quebec. Schefferville sits 1,000 kilometers north of Quebec City. There is no road inches. You get there by train or by plane, and the train, the historic Quebec North Shore and Labrador Railway, is the only surface connection to the outside world. The town is subarctic. The winters are serious in a way that makes Winnipeg feel temperate. It was built in the early 1950s to service the iron ore deposits that Iron Ore Company of Canada was pulling out of the Labrador Trough. At its peak, Schefferville had thousands of residents, miners and their families living a complete, if remote, life on the edge of the boreal. In November 1982, the company announced the mine was closing permanently. The person who made that announcement was Brian Mulroney, then the president of Iron Ore Company of Canada. Not yet the Prime Minister of Canada, though he would be within 2 years. The closure eliminated the economic reason for Schefferville's existence overnight. And then the company did something remarkable. It offered the laid-off workers their houses for $1 each. Most of them said no. Think about that for a moment. Free houses, or essentially free. And the workers walked away. Because owning a $1 house in a dying subarctic town with no jobs and no road access still meant paying property taxes. Still meant heating bills in a climate where heating is not optional. Still meant being responsible for a property that you couldn't sell because nobody was buying, in a community that was rapidly running out of reasons to exist. And here's what nobody tells you about Schefferville. About 200 people still live there, mostly in New and Naskapi First Nations communities who have been in this territory for thousands of years and aren't going anywhere, because this is their home in a way it never quite was for the mining company. The town that Iron Ore built and abandoned is still inhabited, just not by the people it was built for. The houses that weren't taken at $1 apiece eventually just sat empty in the subarctic. The cold doing what cold does to unheated structures over time. What comes next on this list makes Schefferville look almost manageable. Because number 1 didn't just have a town that emptied. It had a town that was literally picked up off the ground and shipped somewhere else. Number 1, Uranium City, Saskatchewan. The name alone tells you something. This wasn't a place that grew up around a resource and slowly built an identity. This was a place named, from its first breath, for its only reason to exist. El Dorado Nuclear Limited established Uranium City in the early 1950s. 750 kilometers northeast of Edmonton, in the far north of Saskatchewan. At its height, the town had a population of several thousand people. It had schools. It had a hospital. It had a hockey arena. Regular air service ran in and out. It was, by every metric, a functioning Canadian town, albeit one that happened to be impossibly remote and entirely dependent on a single industry and a single company. In December 1981, El Dorado Nuclear announced the mine was closing. By 1985, the population had collapsed from thousands to 180 people. Over 600 houses were left vacant. Doors boarded up, windows shuttered, the whole physical substance of people's lives simply abandoned. Some residents who had spent years building their own homes, putting their own labor, their own savings, their own futures into the walls, just walked away. Because they had to. Because there was nowhere else to be and no way to stay. And here's what nobody tells you. And this is the detail that makes Uranium City unlike anything else in Canada. Contractors showed up with flatbed trucks and barges, and they loaded the houses onto them. And they floated those houses down the river to Fort McMurray. Not the furniture, the houses, the physical structures. Because in Fort McMurray, which was booming, those houses had value. In Uranium City, they had none. So they were removed. Hundreds of them. Gone. The ones left behind. The residents who remained moved into a zone roughly half a mile square, the only area where hydro and water service was still being maintained. The rest of the town was left to the cold, to the animals, to the slow work of time. Today, fewer than 100 people live in Uranium City. There is no MLS market. There is no active real estate listing you can click on. If you want to buy property there, you are navigating something more like an archaeological dig than a real estate transaction. And yet here is the thing that has to be said about all 10 places on this list, including this one. Every single one of them was once someone's home in the fullest sense of that word. People were born in these towns, fell in love in these towns, buried their parents here, built hockey teams and community choirs and church basements, and New Year's Eve traditions that nobody outside the town ever heard about. The housing crisis that everyone talks about in Toronto and Vancouver is real. But the housing crisis that nobody talks about, the one that emptied out Uranium City and Shefferville and Leaf Rapids and a dozen towns like them, that one is real too. And it's older, and in some ways it's sadder, because there was never a bidding war over what was lost. There was just a company decision, a closure announcement, and then silence. The question that this whole list is really asking isn't, where are the cheap houses? It's why those houses got cheap. What that cost, who paid for it, and whether, in 2026, with remote work and a national housing crisis, and a generation of Canadians who can't afford a square meter in any major city, any of these places get a second chapter they actually deserve. Some of them are starting to find out. $700,000. That's the average Canadian house price. And scattered across this country, from the Yukon to Cape Breton, from the Quebec subarctic to the BC. Rockies are communities that were built, populated, hollowed out, and left behind. Houses worth almost nothing by conventional measure. Streets that were once full and are now quiet. There's no tidy resolution here. Some of these towns are genuinely coming back. Some of them aren't. But all of them are asking the same question that most Canadians between 25 and 50 are asking in their own lives. Is there a way to live in this country that doesn't require surrendering everything else you care about just to put a roof over your head? The answer might be in places you haven't thought to look yet. That's the thing about Canada. It's enormous, and a lot of it has been forgotten. Maybe it doesn't have to stay that way.